Hey there, Karenology speaking. This story is packed with twists, turns, and pure insanity. I was barely out of my truck when I saw her marching toward me, phone in hand, the unmistakable glare of self-righteous fury in her eyes. "You can't park here! This is private property!" she snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at my driveway. My driveway. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "Karen, this is my house, my driveway, my truck is parked on my property." She scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I had just said the most absurd thing imaginable. Actually, I spoke with the city council last year about this stretch of land. It technically falls within disputed zoning laws, which means, according to regulations, I have as much right to this space as you do. And since I've been here longer, I have priority. I stared at her, momentarily speechless. "That's not how property ownership works," I finally said. "I have the deed. I bought this house." She smirked, already dialing. "Well, let's just see what law enforcement has to say about that, shall we?" And just like that, she was reporting me to 911 for illegal parking. Minutes later, an officer arrived, looking as exhausted as I felt. "Sir, we've received a complaint about a vehicle parked on private property without authorization." I gestured to my house. "This is my property, my truck, my driveway. My name is on the deed." Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "Officer, this man moved in recently and is already causing problems. This driveway has been used by the neighborhood for years. It's common access. He just came in and decided to change the rules." The officer hesitated, as if unsure whether this was an actual dispute or just another one of those ridiculous neighbor squabbles. "Sir, do you have documentation proving ownership?" I pulled out my phone and opened an email with my property deed. "Right here. The boundary lines are clear." Karen was quick to interrupt. "Actually, I have paperwork from a previous zoning review that says differently. You see, a few years back, the city had plans to restructure property lines in this neighborhood. The process never finalized. But as far as local use goes, this driveway was effectively communal." The officer looked from her to me. "Do you have an official claim dispute on file?" "I shouldn't need one because she's making this up," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. Karen gasped dramatically. "How dare you accuse me of lying? I've been here 20 years. You think I don't know my own neighborhood?" The officer sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, I can't enforce property disputes without legal backing. If you want to settle this, you'll have to take it to civil court. But unless there's an official complaint, this is his driveway." Karen's expression darkened. "Fine. If the law won't handle this, I'll take matters into my own hands." That was my first real warning. The next morning, I walked outside to find a tow truck parked at the end of my driveway. Karen stood beside it, arms crossed, triumph plastered across her face. The driver was already setting up the hook to tow my truck. I stormed over. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen smirked. "Since the city is being slow about fixing their mistake, I took the liberty of reporting your truck as an abandoned vehicle blocking my access. I own this part of the land, remember?" "No, you don't," I snapped. "And you just called in a false report." The tow truck driver hesitated, looking between us. "Ma'am, are you sure this is public property? Because if it's his driveway..." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "It's disputed land, and I have proof. Just tow it already." I stepped in front of my truck. "You're not taking my vehicle anywhere. If you try, I'll call the cops for theft." The driver sighed. "Look, buddy, I just take the orders. If she made the call and I got dispatched, I have to follow through unless law enforcement intervenes." Karen smirked wider. "Go ahead, call them. Let's see what they say this time." So I did. I dialed 911 and explained the situation as calmly as I could while Karen stood there, arms folded, radiating smugness. Within minutes, a different officer arrived. One who, judging by his expression, already knew Karen. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "is this another one of your property disputes?" Karen gasped in fake indignation. "Officer, this man is trying to steal public land. My driveway access is being blocked. The officer looked at the tow truck driver. Sir, you got documentation on this tow request? The driver handed over the paperwork. The officer scanned it, then let out a long breath. Karen, this report claims his truck is abandoned on public property, but his name is on the deed. That means this is a false report. Do you know what that means? Karen's smile faltered for the first time. Well, it's complicated. It means, the officer interrupted, that you've just committed an offense. I folded my arms, watching the panic creep into Karen's face. So what now? The officer turned to me. Sir, you have the right to press charges. Karen paled. Wait. This is just a misunderstanding. I was only trying to... I let the silence hang for a moment, savoring the shift in power. Then I smiled. I think I'll hold off, for now. But if she tries this again, I won't be so generous. The officer nodded. Understood. Ma'am, if you attempt to file another false report, you'll be facing serious consequences. Karen's jaw clenched, her face a mixture of anger and humiliation. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed off. The tow truck driver sighed in relief and packed up his equipment. The officer gave me a knowing look. She's not going to stop here. Be careful. I nodded. Trust me, I know. As I watched Karen disappear into her house, a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of something slamming against my garage door. For a brief second, I thought someone had crashed into it. But when I rushed outside, all I saw was Karen standing in my driveway with a clipboard, a smug look plastered on her face. Good morning, neighbor. I thought I'd drop off a little notice for you, she said, waving a stack of papers. What the hell are you doing now, Karen? I demanded, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. She held up the clipboard. This is a cease and desist order. I've formally filed a complaint with the city over your illegal use of the property. You can't just waltz in here and claim what isn't yours. I laughed, shaking my head. You do realize that I actually own this property, right? Your little complaints don't change legal documents. Karen crossed her arms, her expression darkening. You'll see soon enough. The city takes these matters seriously. I'd start looking for alternative parking if I were you. As she strutted away, I felt the frustration build inside me. I knew she was bluffing, or at least, I hoped she was. But there was no way I could just sit back and let her escalate this nonsense. By mid-afternoon, I decided to pay a visit to City Hall to get ahead of whatever scheme she was cooking up. The clerk at the zoning office looked at me with a mixture of exhaustion and sympathy when I explained the situation. Sir, you're not the first person to come in about Ms. Mitchell. She's notorious for filing baseless complaints. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. So, is there actually anything in the city's records about a zoning dispute here? The clerk tapped a few keys on her computer and frowned at the screen. There is a case file, but it's odd. It looks like she submitted an appeal to have the property lines reassessed. However, there's no record of an official ruling, meaning it was never approved. But technically, since she filed it, it's still considered open. That was all she needed to keep pushing her agenda. I leaned in. So, how do I close it? The clerk hesitated. You'd have to formally challenge it with supporting evidence, which means scheduling a hearing. It could take weeks. I exhaled sharply. And in the meantime? She shrugged. She can keep filing complaints, though they won't have any legal weight. It's just annoying. Annoying was an understatement. When I got home, I found a bright orange sticker plastered on my front door. Zoning violation under review. My jaw clenched. Karen was fast. Too fast. Almost like she had someone working with her to push this nonsense through. That night, as I double-checked my security cameras, something didn't sit right with me. Karen had called a tow truck the first time, but this time she had legal paperwork to throw at me. The city clerk said the case file was still open, yet somehow she managed to get a zoning violation order placed on my property in a single afternoon. That meant she had connections. Someone on the inside was helping her. I wasn't going to let her win. The next day, I went back to City Hall, this time with a lawyer. Karen had no idea who she was messing with. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel, didn't waste time. We need to file a counterclaim and request an emergency review. If she's using someone in the city to push this along, we need to find out who. Rachel made a few calls, and within an hour, she had something. Looks like a city inspector named Donald Hayes signed off on this zoning violation, she said, scrolling through her phone. That name ring any bells? I shook my head. No, but if he's involved with Karen, that means this is more than just a petty neighbor dispute, Rachel agreed. We need to see his records. If he's been working with Karen, there will be a pattern. We spent the next few hours digging through city records, finding just what we needed. Hayes had signed off on multiple zoning changes and complaints, almost all connected to properties near Karen's. This wasn't just her usual brand of pettiness. This was a deliberate attempt to manipulate property values. That evening, I decided to confront Karen. When I knocked on her door, she opened it with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Oh, back so soon?" she said. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know what you're doing, Karen. You've got someone inside the city helping you, and I'm going to prove it." Her smile faltered for the briefest moment before she scoffed. "You sound paranoid. Maybe you should get some rest." I took a step closer. "You don't scare me, but you should be scared. Because when I'm done exposing you, you won't just be losing your little power trip, you might be losing your house." For the first time, Karen's mask slipped. A flicker of real panic flashed in her eyes before she quickly masked it with feigned confidence. "You don't have a clue what you're talking about." I smirked. "We'll see about that." As I walked away, I could feel her watching me. This wasn't just a petty feud anymore. This was war. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating aggressively on the nightstand. When I checked the screen, it was a notification from my security system. Someone had been lurking near my driveway in the early hours of the morning. I sat up, my heart pounding. The footage loaded, and there she was, Karen, standing near the edge of my property, flashlight in hand, inspecting something near the boundary line. I exhaled sharply, throwing the blankets off. Enough was enough. I quickly dressed and stepped outside, scanning the area where she had been. Nothing seemed obviously out of place, but the fact that she was snooping around in the middle of the night told me that she was getting desperate. As I made my way back to the house, my phone rang again. This time, Rachel. "I was just about to call you," I said, stepping inside. "I have something," she said, without preamble. "Hayes, the city inspector? I did some digging. He's had multiple complaints against him for irregularities in zoning approvals. The guy has been on thin ice for years, but he's always managed to stay under the radar. And guess what? Karen is tied to at least 3 of those cases. She's been manipulating property lines for years." I let out a low whistle. "And now she's trying to do it to me." "Exactly. You said she was out near your property last night. She's looking for something specific, something she can use to justify her claim. If she gets away with it, you could end up in a legal battle over your own land." A knot of anger formed in my stomach. "Not happening. What do I do?" Rachel hesitated. "We need to catch her in the act. We need undeniable proof that she's falsifying evidence." That evening, I set up extra security cameras, adjusting the angles to cover more of the driveway and boundary line. Then I waited. It didn't take long. Just after midnight, my phone buzzed again. Motion detected. I pulled up the live feed, and there she was, crouched near the property marker with a hammer and a small wooden stake. My pulse quickened. She was trying to move the property line. I stepped outside quietly, making my way toward her. "Karen, I wouldn't do that if I were you." She startled, whipping around to face me, her expression a mix of shock and irritation. "Oh, you scared me. I was just trespassing, tampering with property lines, trying to commit fraud," I finished for her. "You want to tell me what you're doing before I call the cops?" She straightened up, gripping the stake tightly. "I was just checking something. I heard there was an issue with the markers. You heard that from yourself." I pulled out my phone. "Because I have footage of you sneaking around my property the past 2 nights. This isn't some innocent mistake. You're trying to steal land that doesn't belong to you." Her face paled, then flushed red with anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You're new here. You don't understand how things work in this neighborhood." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "I understand more than you think. I know about Hayes. I know about the other properties you've done this to. And I know that if I call the right people, your entire scheme falls apart." For the first time, Karen looked genuinely unsettled. Her fingers twitched around the stake before she abruptly dropped it, turning on her heel. "You'll regret this," she muttered before storming off. I stood there for a moment, heart still hammering. I had proof now, and Karen knew it. Rachel was thrilled when I sent her the footage the next morning. "This is perfect. We can file an official complaint with the city. If she's been working with Hayes, this could bring them both down." By that afternoon, we submitted everything, and then we waited. But Karen wasn't going down quietly. The next day, I woke up to find my truck vandalized. Deep scratches ran across the doors, and one of the side mirrors had been ripped clean off. I clenched my fists. I didn't need to ask who did it. I called Rachel immediately. "She escalated. She trashed my truck." Rachel sighed. "That's destruction of property. You need to file a police report." I did exactly that. The officer who showed up took one look at the damage and sighed. "Was it Karen?" "Of course it was." He nodded. "We've had other complaints about her, but without hard evidence. I have security cameras." That got his attention. "You have footage of her doing this?" "No, but I have footage of her sneaking onto my property at night. And I have proof that she's been trying to falsify property lines. She's been harassing me since the day I moved in." The officer took down all the details and promised to escalate it. As I watched him drive away, I knew this wasn't over. Karen had just made a serious mistake, and now it was only a matter of time before she finally faced the consequences. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of my vandalized truck again, but this time with a renewed sense of determination. Karen had crossed the line. This wasn't just about stolen property lines or bogus zoning claims anymore. She had escalated to full-blown criminal behavior, and I was done playing defense. Rachel wasted no time. I sent the footage to my contacts at the city attorney's office. They're already reviewing Hayes' involvement in other zoning disputes. This is bigger than just your property now. That was the first piece of good news I'd had in days. "And the police report?" I asked. "They've started an official investigation, but Karen is slippery. She's been getting away with this for years because she knows how to manipulate the system. We need something that forces their hand." That something arrived sooner than expected. Late that afternoon, my phone rang with an unknown number. When I picked up, a shaky voice said, "I think I have something you'll want to see. Can we meet?" I recognized the voice almost immediately. An elderly neighbor named Mr. Carter. He lived a few houses down, mostly kept to himself, but I'd seen him watching things unfold from his porch. "Meet where?" I asked cautiously. "My place. But don't park out front. Karen watches everything." That was enough to make my pulse quicken. I grabbed my keys and walked to his house, taking a less direct route through the alley. Mr. Carter opened the door cautiously before waving me inside. He led me to his small living room, where a stack of old files sat on the coffee table. "Karen doesn't know I kept these," he said. "But she's been pulling the same scam for years. I knew it would catch up to her eventually." I flipped through the files and felt my stomach drop. Property disputes, complaints, quiet settlements. Every single case had Karen's name attached. "How did you get these?" I asked. Mr. Carter exhaled slowly. "I used to work in real estate law. When she pulled her stunt on me years ago, I started keeping records. I knew she'd try it again with someone else." This was it. This was the final piece I needed. "Do you mind if I take copies of these?" I asked. "You can take the originals. I don't want them in my house anymore." By the time I got back home, Rachel was already waiting. "You're not going to believe this," I said, dropping the files onto the table. Her eyes widened as she flipped through them. This is more than enough to put her away. She's been running this scam for decades. She even falsified property deeds on 2 separate occasions. We can take this straight to the DA. That night, I hardly slept. I knew this was far from over. Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. And sure enough, the next morning, she made her move. A knock on my door jolted me awake. When I opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood there, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Hayes, we have a warrant to search your property. We received a report that you've been illegally modifying the zoning markers." I felt a cold wave of realization crash over me. "Let me guess, Karen filed the complaint?" One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. "We're just following procedure." I stepped aside, letting them in. They combed through my yard, checking the boundary markers, but they wouldn't find anything because I hadn't touched a thing. After nearly an hour, they came back looking mildly frustrated. "Everything checks out," one of them admitted, "but we still need to file this as a formal investigation." Rachel arrived just as they were wrapping up. "This is exactly what I was worried about," she said. "She's trying to turn the system against you. But don't worry. After what I sent to the DA this morning, Karen won't have the upper hand for long." Hours later, the retaliation hit its peak. Karen was standing on her porch, phone in hand, yelling into the receiver. I walked closer, just in time to hear, "You said this would be taken care of. I need this investigation to stick." She turned just as I stepped into view, her face twisting in rage. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "This isn't over," I smirked. "Oh, it is. You just don't know it yet." That evening, Rachel got the call we'd been waiting for. "The DA is launching a full-scale investigation. They're reopening several cases, including the ones from Mr. Carter's files. Karen is officially under scrutiny, and Hayes is likely going down with her." I exhaled, tension finally easing from my shoulders. "So what happens next?" "Now?" Rachel said. "We watch her fall apart." As I glanced toward Karen's house, I saw her watching from the window, a look of pure hatred in her eyes. She knew. And for the first time, she was afraid. Karen was unraveling, and she knew it. Over the next few days, I watched her from my porch as she made frantic phone calls, pacing her driveway like a caged animal. The once smug and arrogant woman now looked cornered, her voice laced with desperation, as she tried to talk her way out of the hole she had dug for herself. But it was too late. The investigation was moving forward, and this time, she couldn't manipulate the system in her favor. Rachel called me early in the morning. "You're going to want to see this," she said. "Check the local news." I grabbed my phone and pulled up the latest report. There it was, Karen's name plastered across the screen. The headline read, "Local resident under investigation for property fraud and corruption ties." My chest tightened as I listened to the reporter detailing the scope of Karen's scheme. Her connections with Hayes, the manipulated property lines, and the harassment tactics she had used for years were now under scrutiny. Karen stepped outside as if she could feel my eyes on her. The moment she saw me, her face contorted with pure venom. "You did this to me!" she shrieked. "You ruined everything!" I remained standing on my porch, arms crossed. "You did this to yourself, Karen." She stormed toward me, fists clenched. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think you're going to get away with this?" Her voice cracked under the weight of panic. I tilted my head. "I don't have to get away with anything. Unlike you, I never broke the law." She turned to storm back inside, but stopped short when two unmarked black cars pulled up in front of her house. The doors swung open, and men in suits stepped out. Federal investigators. Karen turned pale, her bravado crumbling in an instant. One of the agents approached her, flipping open his badge. "Ma'am, we need to have a word with you regarding an ongoing investigation. We have a warrant to search your property." I could see the panic setting in. Karen's eyes darted around wildly, as if searching for an escape. But there was none. With shaking hands, she tried to regain control. "This is ridiculous. You can't just barge in here. I have rights." "And you'll have a chance to exercise them in court," the agent replied, unfazed. "But for now, step aside." The next few minutes were surreal. I watched as federal agents entered her home, combing through her files and collecting evidence. Karen stood frozen on her front lawn, powerless. The woman who had spent years bullying and manipulating her neighbors was now completely and utterly defeated. Rachel called again. "She's finished," she said, barely containing her satisfaction. "The investigation is expanding, and Hayes is already throwing her under the bus. He's trying to make a deal, and guess who he's using as a bargaining chip?" I chuckled. "Let me guess. Karen?" "Exactly. He's turning over records that showed just how deep she was in this mess. Every fraudulent zoning claim, every shady deal, he's laying it all out. She's looking at serious charges." Karen turned toward me one last time, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You think this is over?" she hissed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I smirked. "Oh, I think I do, and so do they." The agents finished their search, and one of them turned to Karen. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning." Karen stumbled back, eyes wide. "You can't arrest me. I haven't done anything wrong." "No one said anything about an arrest, but if you refuse, we'll have to escalate the situation." The agent's voice was calm but firm. Karen looked at me one last time before reluctantly stepping toward the car. She was out of options. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath. I watched as they drove her away. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. The neighborhood was silent, peaceful. Rachel met me later that evening. "You did it," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "She's done for. The DA is building a strong case, and with the evidence we've provided, she won't be able to weasel her way out of this one." I exhaled, finally allowing myself to relax. "So what happens now?" "Now?" Rachel grinned. "Now you get your life back." A few weeks later, the official news broke. Karen had been indicted on multiple charges, ranging from fraud to falsification of legal documents. Hayes, in an attempt to save himself, had cooperated fully, handing over everything the investigators needed. The city officially ruled in my favor regarding the zoning dispute, and the violation on my property was formally dismissed. Neighbors started coming out more, talking again, no longer living under the shadow of Karen's control. One by one, people approached me, offering thanks, sharing their own stories of how she had tormented them for years. It was as if the entire street had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. One evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset when Mr. Carter walked up. "Hell of a thing you did, son," he said, leaning on his cane. "Took her down when nobody else could." I chuckled, just stood my ground. He nodded approvingly. "Well, we're all damn glad you did." We've waited a long time to see justice catch up to her. As I sat there, I realized he was right. I hadn't set out to be anyone's hero. I just wanted to live in peace. But sometimes, standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone else too. And as the last traces of Karen's reign of terror faded, I knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't be coming back.